Okay, all right. Well, welcome back. Here we go again on another video, another module for the buyer course for realtors. And going to be talking in this video about when you're at that point, when you're ready to write and submit an offer for your buyers. So I've kind of got a few tips here to help you to make sure that you're ready. So let's go ahead and do a share screen here. And okay, everything's looking good. You're familiar with that. See if we can go forward. I'm not getting cooperation today. Okay, here we go. All right, writing, submitting an offer. Okay, here's the first screen. So talking about choosing a property. So you need to help your buyers make a decision on which property they want to choose. And when I say help, give them the information they need on the neighborhood, on the area, anything you know about the house. If you got two or three properties that they're really interested in, give them the pluses, give them the minuses, and let them make the decision. If they need to go out for a second showing, a third showing, go ahead and do it. If they need to bring other people to the showing, family members or friends, they want to have to take a look at it, that's fine. Give them all the information they need. You can do a market analysis. You do the sold and available comparables in the neighborhood, in the area, so that way they have a sense of the list price and what they can do to make an offer. I always try to get the seller property disclosure ahead of time also, because if there's something catastrophic in the property disclosure, it's good to get that ahead of time before you write an offer. So if there's some foundation issues, if there's been prior water damage, flooding, like here where I live, we had a major flood a couple years ago and a lot of properties were damaged. So if that house that you're looking at didn't get any water damage during that huge flood, I mean, that's a good sign. If they did have water damage, then you need to make sure that they provide the appropriate documentation on all the work that was done, all the repair, all the receipts, everything. So I always like to get that property disclosure up front. And then whatever questions the buyers have as a result of the showings or doing their research, make sure you follow up with the listing agent. A lot of times before you submit an offer, you can get your questions answered. If it's a competitive situation and there's going to be multiple offers, sometimes it is hard to get a reply back from the listing agent on the questions. So you need to kind of coach your buyers on that. And, one thing about what I've been doing this for a lot of years. There's no need to close on your buyers. There's no need to do the alternative of choice and all these kind of things. If the property had this, you make an offer. I mean, that stuff is all so old school and you don't really need to do it. What happens nowadays when you're working with your buyers, and you know this if you're experienced, your buyer is going to tell you. And then you're going to know if you've looked at 20, 30 properties, you know the ones they don't like, and then you're going to know the ones that they do like and they're interested in by the questions they ask and by them just telling you. So you're going to know this. Now here's the last thing I put here is make sure all buyers see the property that are going to be submitting an offer. So I ran into this a few years ago. I was helping a couple and who went out of town? The wife went out of town. And I was looking at the house with the husband and the husband's like, oh yeah, this is a great house. My wife is going to like it. I know it. And so he talked to her on the phone. He sent her pictures. They talked it over. And so he's like, let's go ahead and submit an offer. So naive as I was, and especially not having the wife take a look at it. I mean, come on, I've been married now, what, 13 years? I can't even keep track. That, the wife has to be involved in the decision. So we wrote the offer. The wife came back from her trip. She didn't like the house, oops. So it was kind of a bad situation. So we went forward with the inspection, and then there were a few items in the inspection, so they terminated per the inspection. But my advice to you, whenever you're going to write an offer, if it's a couple, two, three people, whatever it is, make sure they all see the property before you submit the offer. Okay, let's talk a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about getting prepared for the offer. So if it's going to be a lender, make sure you get the lender pre-approval letter for the property that you're going to submit an offer. Now you can have a generic letter from the lender that kind of just covers, any property that they submit an offer on. That's going to be okay. If you want to get a tailored letter, depending on your relationship with the lender and what the buyer has with the lender, you can get a tailored lender letter to that specific address and to that specific price. If you're helping a cash buyer, then you need to make sure that they have a funds statement to be able to present along with the offer that shows they have the cash somewhere in a bank account, in a IRA, 401k, whatever it is. They need to verify funds. So we need to provide a copy of that, and we can blank out, you know, account codes and all that kind of stuff. The other thing is you want to get the legal names of the buyers. So how do they want to take title? So some people have 3 or 4 names. Some people, the husband and wife, don't have the same name. Like my wife, she kept her name, which is fine. So you need to make sure you get the legal name of both of them. The other thing I always talk about with my buyers is, are they going to be traveling? Are they going to be out of town anytime in the next 30 to 45 days after the date of the contract? The big thing is that ideally you want to have them there primarily for the inspection. So if you're scheduling the inspection a week to 2 weeks after the contract date, and then in the next video, I'm going to give some negotiating tips on how we can work with the inspection dates to make it more attractive to the seller. The other thing is closing dates. Nowadays, a lot of people do mail outs, or you could do a power of attorney where one person signs for the other person. We just need to make sure that we coordinate that ahead of time. You're representing the buyer, so you need to coordinate that with the lender and the title company. And the appraisal, that's not as critical, that they need to be there, but you need to talk through all these dates and then work with your managing broker if you don't know, but there's kind of a guideline for the dates that you use when you're preparing an offer. The inspection, usually a week to 2 weeks after contract date. The closing, depending on the lender, you need to kind of get buy-in from the lender, usually 30 to 45 days. Nowadays, with a lot of stuff going on in the lending industry, they want 40 to 45 days. So make sure that you double check that with the lender. And then also the appraisal. The appraisal the last couple of years has really been pushed out a lot more because it's like in my market, it's been really, really busy. And a lot of times you don't want to schedule the appraisal until you get through the inspection because there's an out of pocket for the appraisal to your buyer. Now, some lenders are okay where if you do schedule an appraisal, the deal falls through, they'll credit that to the next deal. So make sure that you work with your lender on that. And appraisals, yeah, that's something you need to make sure you get buy-in from your lender. The other thing you talk through with your buyer is how much money are they going to put down, and this is appropriate, primarily from a lender standpoint. So are they putting 20% down, 40% down, 10%, whatever that number is, you need to have that ahead of time because you put that into the contract. And then earnest money, the earnest money will be listed on the MLS, and that's usually a guideline, but a lot of times we want to follow the guideline. And so if they say the house is a $300,000 house, they're asking for $5,000 earnest money, that's okay. Um, Make sure that when you go through the contract with your buyer, that you talk through the ramifications of the earnest money. Okay. Now, once you prepare the offer, and the other part is you need to do the offer price. Okay. Kind of a big thing I forgot there. But I have it on the slide. So you work together on this. You don't dictate what the offer price is going to be. Provide them the information they need, give them your thoughts, but let them decide. It's their decision because you don't want to be on the hook. If the house is listed at 450,000 and you say, well, let's put it in at 450 or let's put it in at 430, whatever number you come up with, and then it doesn't work out, you don't want to be the one held accountable after the fact. You want everybody to buy into it, and that's why I feel it's best to let the buyer make that decision. You don't dictate. Remember, we're not a part of the transaction. We're helping. We're a consultant. We're an advisor. We're giving the information that our buyers need. So I will never, ever make decisions for my clients. And I tell them that. And if they ask me what I think, I'll tell them what I think and I'll kind of give them guidelines. But I want all of us to be making the decision together, and especially on offer price, I want them to make that decision. Okay. It's more art than science sometimes. So if it's a buyer's market and a house is listed at 250, how low can you go? A lot of it's going to be predicated on how many days the house has been on the market. Have they had any other offers? Do they have a contract? Did it fall through? These are all the variables that you're going to need to kind of provide to your buyer, and you're going to know this too. If the house has been on the market 3 months and you're heading into the winter and it's November, let's say, you can be pretty aggressive. If the house has been on the market a week and it's in the spring, and even if it's a buyer's market, they're not going to take $10,000, $15,000 less than the offer price. I mean, you can sell it, and it's also based on what price point it is. If you're at 250 and you go in 20K lower, that's a pretty big drop. If you're at like 780 and you going in at 760, it's not that huge of a drop. So you look at the percentages, right? What percentage of price are you going to go in at? But it's also going to be based on how many days it's been on the market, what kind of condition the property's in. If you go in and look at a property, it's the first day on the market, it's really updated, it's in a great location, it looks really hot, it's going to be competitive, okay? So be prepared for that, and that's what we coach our buyers on. So we have to kind of give them a reality check, especially for listings that are new, if you want to go in aggressive. And the other thing I put on the offer price here, try to find out everything you can about the sellers. What is their situation? Where are they going? The listing agent doesn't have to disclose that, but if you chit chat with them, one strategy that I use, I'll call the listing agent sometimes and say, hey, I'll ask them some innocuous question. And even if I know the answer, I'll just ask it. I'll say, I didn't know offhand, is the hot tub included? And then the agent might say, oh yeah, well, I had it in the remarks. It's included. And then I'll say, okay, that's great. It's a really nice house. My buyers like it. And then I'll just be quiet. Use the power of silence. And sometimes some listing agents, they get nervous, especially ones that are not, pros that have been around, and they'll start spilling their beans, right? They're like, oh, well, I'm glad your buyers like it. My sellers have done a good job with it, and they're looking at moving, and they're going to go buy a bigger house. And in fact, they've already got a contract on that house. So, they're really motivated. I mean, this is all great information, right? So use the power of silence. I know I've called some listing agents, and I'll ask a question, they'll answer it, and then I'll just make a statement, and then the listing agent will be quiet, and the listing agent won't say anything. And then I'll say, oh, okay. And they'll say, well, did you ask a question? I said, well, no, not really. See, so that listing agent understands. So that's where you can use the power of silence to get more information from the listing agent. Okay, here we go. Now, writing the contract, One thing that I do, I have a web-based contract program that I use through my MLS. Years ago when I started in 02, 03, it was a nightmare. You know, you had to get like a PC-based contract writing system. It only worked on my desktop. I mean, nowadays, I mean, we're spoiled. I mean, you can write contracts probably on your iPad. I'm not doing it, but you know, whenever I have a laptop, if I'm traveling, I got my laptop, I can write an offer. So you want to make sure that you're using a web-based contract program. Mine is included in my MLS with my MLS fees. Um, so if you're new, talk to your managing broker, find out what the options are. The other thing I highly recommend is have an electronic signature program. There are many different electronic signature programs out there. And what I use, and I don't make any money, I try to contact them, but anyway, DocuSign, D-O-C-U sign, DocuSign. And I've been using that now for, gosh, 6, 7 years. It's a good program. I joke that I helped one of my buyers a few years ago, and she's a grandmother from Iceland, and she must have been in her mid-60s. So if Hala can use an electronic signature program, anybody can. So don't worry about it. It's very simple to use, and once you start using it, you'll never, ever not want to use it. I mean, it's pretty amazing. Now, when you're writing a contract, sorry about that, home office here, make this an authentic training video. So when you're writing the contract itself, write a clean and proper contract. If you're new, work with your managing broker and make sure that you follow all the guidelines in the contract. A lot of this, once you start doing a few contracts, you can develop a template. And in my contract program, whenever I write an offer, I have a lot of the fields pre-filled out that I'm going to answer the same way in every contract. So that is a good tool to use. But when I say a clean and proper contract, make sure all the dates are, you know, accurate, make sure all the fields are filled in properly, and don't leave anything unanswered. And that's what I talk about, filling in all the blanks. And you can work with your managing broker. You can take a contract class through your local realtor association. When I'm writing a contract, I'll get the seller names from the listing or from public records, and then I plug that into the offer. I try to minimize any conditions in the additional provisions. Now, I'm not a lawyer. Most of you are not going to be lawyers. And even if you are a lawyer, most real estate commissions, they don't want you writing in free-form legalese in the additional provisions. The most I will do, I will write the property will be delivered in a professionally clean condition. That's it. And that's kind of vague because that means that they could professionally clean it themselves or they could hire a cleaning company to do it. Whenever you start putting in additional conditions, clauses in that section, most contracts have a free form section. Ours is called additional provisions. Make sure you get approval from your managing broker, or if it's a special situation and your buyers have hired a lawyer, get the language from your lawyer. The other thing I do is I try to avoid seller concessions on the front end. What this is, for example, a lot of people say there's a carpet allowance. House is in really poor condition. The seller is going to offer $3,000 seller concession. So what happens there is price of the house, let's say is $300,000, seller concession $3,000, price of the property still $300,000. That $3,000 concession, and this is how it is, I'm sure in most states, that's how it is here in Colorado, that $3,000 does not get written back to the buyer at the closing. You use that $3,000 towards funds that the seller has the closing costs of the seller, The buyer is going to have at closing. And the closing costs are going to be loan costs, prepaids, insurance, things like that. Now, the reason I don't like to do the concession up front, let's say the property is 300,000 and they're offering a concession of 3,000. You're going through the inspection, and that's going to be in a later video. We'll talk about the inspection process. But let's say you're going through the inspection and a number of items come up, and let's say the repairs are going to cost $3,000 and the seller doesn't have the time or the resources to get it done, but they're willing to give a credit. So now your buyer can get a credit of $6,000. What happens sometimes, and this is where you need to work with your lender, there sometimes is a cap on how much the lender is going to allow for a concession at the closing. And this happened to me a few years ago. I was the seller, representing the seller, and I think there was concessions of about $4,500, but the lender for the buyer only allowed like $2,800, and I think it was because the property price was around 280-ish. So the difference between that 4,500 and that 2,800 was just a windfall for my seller. So I was looking good in that situation because I was helping the seller and he got an additional $1,700 at the closing. And yeah, he bought me lunch afterwards, so that was pretty good. So, but if you're representing the buyer and that happens to you, $300,000 house, and you want to get a $6,000 concession, the lender won't approve that much. So that's where you got to be working closely with your lender to make sure that that's covered. Now, for example, if the house, they're offering the $3,000 concession, you could just take that right off the price of the property. And let's say you agree on like $295, and then you say, we'll knock off the other three, and we'll make the purchase price $292. Follow my math there. The other thing I don't like about big concessions is, and we'll talk about this in another video too, when I talk about appraisals, when you do big concessions, the appraised value is the purchase price. So let's say you're doing a bigger property and it's like $750 and you're giving a concession of like $10,000. The purchase price is going to be $750. If it appraises at $740, then you got to negotiate that $10,000 delta. So that's another reason why I don't like doing a big seller concession on the front end, and then give you flexibility on the inspection as well as the appraisal. And I think I talked that long about that subject there. Now the earnest money with the contract, back in the old days, we used to submit the offer and we give it to the agent and we'd have the earnest money check with the offer. You could still do that today. A lot of people now do an alternative earnest money deadline, and usually it's 24, 48, 72 hours after the signed contract, mutual execution of the contract. People put in MEC. I don't like it to be more than 48 hours unless there's extenuating circumstances with your buyer being out of state and you can't get the check from them. You can also, a lot of times, you can do a wire transfer of earnest money, and I've done that before too. Key thing is there on the wire transfer, make sure you verify all the information so your buyer is doing a valid wire transfer to a good bank account, so there's no hiccups there, okay? I had one years ago on a closing, and my buyers were going to wire all their money on the closing, and this was a transaction around 680 or something. So they were doing a transfer around 660, 670, and there was a mistake with the wire, the bank, the information they gave us, and my clients are trying to wire this money to this bank and it wasn't working and it wasn't the right bank. They gave us the wrong information. So make sure you double check that because, you don't want your buyer's money to end up like in the Grand Cayman or something, right? Okay, this is pretty, intuitive. You're going to be in a buyer market or a seller market. You're going to know this. If you're in a buyer's market, you're going to have more opportunity to be aggressive, to go in with a lower price offer. You can kind of work the seller a little bit. If the house has been on the market, a long time, the sellers are really motivated. I mean, you're going to know this. If it's a seller's market, and you're going to know this too. I mean, that's how it's been for me the last couple of years here in the Denver Boulder area. Very, very hot market. A lot of multi-offer situations, 5, 10, 15. I know in parts of Denver, they get 20, 25 offers on kind of the starter homes in the 200, 250K range. Study your market, know your competition, get a sense of, who are the other people that are going to be submitting offers. You can kind of get a feel sometimes from the listing agent if they are being helpful, if they're giving you guidance, and if it's a cash offer you're going up against. And I'm going to talk about ways that you can beat cash offers if you have a lender in the next video. And then just advise your buyer accordingly based on the market that you're in. Make sure they're dealing in reality. You don't want a buyer who's submitting an offer on a house, and it's been on the market not even a week, it's pretty hot, and they go in at 95% of the purchase price. That's not going to work, okay? All right. Now, next thing here is you want to set the expectation when you're submitting the offer. I usually give a response time of 24 hours. So when I'm talking about set expectation, let your buyer know what the process is. We're going to submit the offer. Sometimes we're going to hear back from the listing agent. Sometimes we're not. If it's competitive, they might choose another offer. A lot of times they don't give you a second chance. So you want to try to go in sometimes with your best offer, but set the expectations for your buyer because this is the most emotional they're going to be throughout the entire process. If you're submitting an offer in the afternoon at 3 o'clock and you give them until noon the next morning, a lot of times your buyers, they have a hard time sleeping. They're texting you at night. They're emailing you at night. And just keep reassuring them, don't worry. When I hear something, I'll let you know. I'll keep you posted, okay? Now, when you're submitting the offer, the response time is only for accepting the offer. They can give a counter offer after that deadline. So when you submit an offer, let's say you're submitting an offer and today it's Saturday and you're giving them until Sunday, 8 p.m. If they don't agree to it by 8 p.m., they're not agreeing to that contract and they can give a counter afterwards. And so that is a little bit tricky. So make sure and review that with your managing broker if you're new. And I even have some experienced agents think that you have to submit the counter before the deadline. You don't have to. Let your buyers know sometimes you won't hear back from the listing agent, especially if it's a seller's market or if you're dealing, with some of these other listing agents who are limited service. And some of those agents are just not going to be that involved in the process. And you end up just giving the offer to the seller and then they make a decision. This is a hard thing for us to deal with. So be prepared because I know I had this happen to me a couple years ago and I was helping one of my buyers. And this was one of the buyers I've been helping a long time. And I think this was the second or third offer that we had written, and we wrote a full price offer. I never heard back from the listing agent. And the first thing I heard back from the listing agent the next morning was that the sellers had agreed to another offer. And I mean, I was heartbroken. I was like, oh my God. I mean, And naturally, I mean, my buyer, I mean, they were upset. The husband, he went off, he contacted the real estate commission, and he contacted that agent directly and was trying to call that agent's boss and all these things. And and unfortunately this happens. I mean, because you do get some realtors that they know another realtor or they work with somebody in their office, and a lot of times it's just not fair. And so be prepared for that. Kind of coach your buyers. You're going to do the best thing you can, the best job that you can, but sometimes you're just not going to hear back from the listing agent. Okay. All right. Well, I think that's a good discussion of, there's all my information there. Okay. So let's go ahead and get to the my face again. How are you? So I think that's a good discussion on preparing an offer and submitting it. Like I said, if you're new, work with your managing broker, work with other agents in your office. If another agent is going to be writing an offer, they're going to have an offer review meeting, make sure that you do that with them. What I do every time I write an offer, the first time, ideally I like to go through the entire offer with my buyer. And if they're out of state and they were here and they went back home and they're moving, I'll do it through email, send them a PDF, then I'll send them the electronic signature program where they can sign off on it. And but I want to make sure that they understand everything about the contract. Another thing that I do, because like I work with a lot of engineers, I'll get a blank copy of a contract and I'll give it to them ahead of time to review. Because the contract itself, I mean, that's the offer, and that's all written by the real estate commission. And so it really goes into great detail on the whole process of buying a property. So if you have a very detailed engineer kind of a buyer, give it to them ahead of time and let them review it. And it's mainly engineers, that's kind of thing you run into. It's interesting, I've helped a lot of lawyers, a lot of lawyer buyers, and a lot of times they're like, yeah, whatever, I'll sign here, no big deal. Everybody has their own style. So, okay, well, that's it for this video, and we'll move on to negotiating tips.